gratefully introduce Kyla. I know you know because you're in academia that we're at the end of the semester, so I'm really grateful for all of you. But you're in for a really good discussion. Dr. Kyla Tienhaara is a Canada, I'm reading this because it's a long title, Canada Research Chair in Economy and Environment and an Assistant Professor in the School of Environmental Studies and the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University in Canada. But I will tell you, if you look at Kyla's work, she is really interested in and an expert in diverse areas of the intersection between economic governance in the economy and environmental governance, and in that capacity has touched on a number of really interesting and diverse fields. For the purpose of today, our overlap in particular has been on the intersection of investment and investment governance and environmental law. So with that, thanks very much, Kyla, for joining us.
All right, hopefully. Oh, yeah, it's working. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me here. Always happy to come down to New York. Our term actually ended on Friday, so I'm still recovering, but very happy to be here. So I want to thank everyone for the invitation, but also more generally for the excellent work that you guys do at CCSI on critically important work on the investment regime. And I want to start off with just a few caveats. The first is that this is really preliminary research. I was hoping to get further into it, but I was teaching a lot this term. And so I'm really here to test out some new ideas, and some might suggest some rather radical ideas. So I encourage you all to challenge me on them, and please point out any important areas that I might have overlooked. And the second caveat is that I'm sort of making an assumption that everyone in the room has at least a basic understanding of climate change. And I just want to note that I'm not interested in debating the existence of climate change or the fact that it's human-caused and indeed is already having really severe impacts on many people's lives. So with that in mind, let's get started. So the reason why I'm increasingly thinking about what some might consider to be radical policy approaches to the climate crisis is that the science is very clear on the fact that we are rapidly running out of time to avoid really catastrophic consequences from climate change. So just last week, a comment was published in Nature by several eminent scientists arguing that there is a risk of certain tipping points, such as the loss of the Amazon rainforest or the West Antarctic ice sheet, being reached even between only 1 and 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And if you're not aware, we've already reached 1 degree of warming, and we're on track for something more like 4 degrees. So such tipping points could create abrupt and irreversible changes to the climate, which these scientists argue is an existential threat to human civilization. And yet, as highlighted recently in another report, the Production Gap Report, as well as a number of other reports and academic articles, the fossil fuel industry continues to explore for more oil and gas and continues to invest in the infrastructure required to extract, transport, and burn more coal, oil, and gas than could safely be exploited if we want to keep below 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees Celsius of warming as set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. As Andrew Grant from Carbon Tracker notes, the oil majors are essentially betting against a 1.5 degree world. In other words, they are betting against a safe future for the generation that is currently taking to the streets every Friday to protest policy inaction. So to summarize, we are rapidly running out of time to avoid tipping points that could lead to abrupt and irreversible changes in the climate system, and our current policy approaches, which primarily focus on trying to dampen demand for fossil fuels rather than addressing supply, are seemingly having very little impact on the investment decisions of fossil fuel companies. If we want to keep unburnable carbon in the ground, we may need to consider more drastic action, which is the context in which nationalization emerges as a policy proposal. So that is the general background that you need to understand the rest of the presentation, which I'm going to divide into 3 parts. So first, I will explain a little bit more about what nationalization is and why it's come up in this context. Next, I will discuss the legality of nationalization under international investment law. And finally, I will discuss what I see as the main legal obstacles to nationalization, which is the requirement for full compensation, and how states might argue for this to be reduced in an arbitration. So nationalization is the process of a government taking control of a business or industry, either by purchasing a majority stake or taking 100% ownership. While nationalization has played an important role in the history of many countries, including the US, contemporary commentary generally associates it with a socialist ideology and assumes that it is something that only occurs in leftist countries in the global south. However, as of late, it has come up in the context of the energy transition in advanced neoliberal economies. So most notably, Justin Trudeau's government in Canada nationalized an oil pipeline in 2018 at the behest of the American owner Kinder Morgan. The company had complained that it was facing, quote, unquantifiable risk due to local opposition to its plans to twin the existing pipeline and triple the amount of tar sands oil that was traveling from Alberta to the west coast. In this case, the government paid what was probably more than fair market value for the asset, and there was no outcry from the industry. And despite it being at odds with Trudeau's desire to project himself as a climate policy champion, the government actually plans on carrying out the proposed expansion project, although they still face a number of obstacles, including legal challenges in domestic courts. So this is clearly not an example of nationalization for decarbonization. In fact, it is the opposite. Nevertheless, the fact that the Canadian government was willing to nationalize a pipeline to deal with what I would argue is a concocted economic crisis about Alberta's tar sands got me thinking as to whether a government at some point in time might come along that was actually willing to nationalize an asset to deal with the very real climate crisis. And then I read the UK Labour Party's manifesto, in which they propose to renationalize a number of assets, including the energy grid, and they make it explicit that this is part of their decarbonisation strategy. In a speech to the Labour Party conference in February of 2018, Jeremy Corbyn stated that the challenge of climate change requires us to radically shift the way we organise our economy. In 1945, elected to govern a country ravaged by 6 years of war, the great Attlee Labour government knew that the only way to rebuild our economy was through decisive turn to collective action. Necessary action to help avert the climate catastrophe requires us to be at least as radical. With the national grid in public hands, we can put tackling climate change at the heart of our energy system. To go green, we must take control of our energy. So while this is the most overt example of a political proposal for nationalization to achieve decarbonization, there are hints of this kind of thinking elsewhere as well, including possibly even here in the US. So before continuing, I would like to note that in discussions around nationalization and decarbonization, there is generally a focus on either utilities, as is the case in the UK, and also in discussions around what's happening in California amidst the wildfires. And then also, separately, there are discussions about nationalizing fossil fuel companies. So the big majors, Exxon, Chevron, and BP, and so forth. There are important differences between these categories. For one, public control of utilities can actually occur at the local level, which is more appropriately called remunicipalization, whereas control of fossil fuel companies is really something that can only be contemplated at the national level. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm really going to focus primarily on nationalizing the fossil fuel industry. So the case for why we might consider nationalizing the fossil fuel industry has been made by a number of authors, and who generally highlight 3 points. So the first is that we need to somehow dismantle the apparatus of opposition to climate policy that has been created by the industry and neuter their power. Obviously, the fact that they are so powerful in the first place kind of undermines the argument that nationalization is something that is realistic. But if we set that aside for the moment and assume that someone in government or a leader has the ability to pull this off, once nationalized, the hold that the industry has over government disappears. A second reason why nationalization is suggested because it is in the public interest for the majority of known fossil fuel reserves to remain in the ground. But corporations do not act on behalf of the public interest, and they will continue to extract fossil fuels until it is no longer profitable. A state owner can opt instead to act against market incentives and in the best interest of the public. The CEO arguably cannot. And then finally, if the industry continues as it is currently, as if nothing needs to change, and then at some point abruptly falls off the edge of a cliff because of either regulation or simply changes in economic reality, then a lot of employees in the fossil fuel industry are going to be left in a lurch. And if we want to actually ensure a just transition, then we need a more managed decline away from fossil fuels and provisions to make new and good green jobs for the workers in the industry. And that kind of, the incentive to avoid this economic and social disruption is clearly there for a public owner but not necessarily for a private owner. So an example of this kind of thinking comes from Carla Santos-Scandier of the Next System Project, who says, to be clear, nationalization is by itself not a panacea. There are, after all, plenty of state-owned fossil fuel companies that are just as good at ignoring the climate crisis as privately owned ones. What we are proposing is a program of nationalization and rapid decommission designed to keep unextractable carbon permanently in the ground while creating the planning space needed for a just transition for affected workers. I have found the work of Scandia and others to be quite inspiring and refreshing, but given my background, my immediate sort of instinct is to think about how such a project, if we found somebody with the political will to carry it out, would play out in investment arbitration. So that is what I want to focus on now. And I would note that I do recognize that there are domestic legal protections in this area in many countries, including here in the US. But I'm only going to talk about the protections under international investment agreements, because that is what I know, but also because I feel like a lot of the commentators in this space seem to be unaware of investment treaties, or at least they're not explicitly addressing the implications of them in the work that I have seen. So this particular audience would be probably very familiar with the fact that there are over 3,000 bilateral investment treaties and other treaties such as regional trade agreements and sectoral agreements like the Energy Charter Treaty that contain protections for foreign investors and provide them with access to international arbitration in a process known as Investor-State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. In this system, they can bring claims against the state for actions that have negatively affected their investors. Probably also all aware of the fact that ISDS is very controversial for a wide number of reasons. There are some procedural aspects that are critiqued, but also the fact that investors can use it to challenge public interest regulations, such as famously cigarette packaging rules that were designed to protect public health, and various types of measures that were put in place to protect the environment. So I've done work in that area, but the focus on this discussion, the focus in that area is often on so-called indirect expropriation, because you're trying to determine whether a regulation actually amounts to expropriation, or on very vague provisions such as fair and equitable treatment. Theoretically, when we're talking about nationalization, which is direct expropriation, it should be a little bit more straightforward. It clearly falls under the purview of investment treaties. However, there is always some room for ambiguity. For example, while international investment treaties should only cover foreign investors, in practice, companies can route their investments through foreign subsidiaries in an attempt to gain protection. And this is apparently what is already happening in the UK, where a number of British energy companies have moved their holdings so that they can take advantage of bilateral agreements. And so even though I think everybody feels that there's probably very little likelihood of a Corbyn government actually getting elected, these companies are concerned enough about the prospect of nationalization, and they're already thinking about how to protect themselves under investment treaties. But what do these treaties actually say about nationalization? Obviously it varies, but generally speaking, nationalization is legal if it is for public purpose, if it is non-discriminatory, so foreign investors aren't singled out and investors from a particular country aren't singled out. It's carried out with due process and upon payment of adequate and effective compensation. It's possible that those other aspects, the public purpose, the non-discriminatory nature, might actually be challenged by an investor in an arbitration, but I think that the biggest sticking point is going to be on the payment of compensation, and particularly the amount of compensation. So then let's talk a little bit more about how compensation is dealt with in these treaties. So taking NAFTA as an example, we can see that under Article 1110.2, compensation shall be equivalent to the fair market value of the expropriated investment immediately before the expropriation took place, and shall not reflect any change in value occurring because the intended expropriation had become known earlier. Valuation criteria shall include going concern value, asset value, including declared tax value of tangible property, and other criteria as appropriate to determine fair market value. So there are two important things to note here. First is the timing of the valuation is before the planned nationalization is announced. And that is important and because some of the proposals that I've seen about how we can have nationalization for decarbonization have seemed to assume that governments will be able to make an announcement in advance, depress the share price, and then be able to purchase the shares of the fossil fuel company for a really good deal. But clearly, that is not something that would be possible under NAFTA or many other investment treaties. The second thing to note is that this idea of fair market value, obviously there are some criteria that have been laid out here, but it's still, and in NAFTA I should say, there is more clarity on how it is to be determined, but it's a rather sort of open term. It's generally considered the same as book value or what an arm's length buyer would pay in an open market. But still, there is a lot of ambiguity as to what it means. And this is, fair market value seems to be the sort of standard across treaties. There are a few instances where we have different criteria, such as just or adequate compensation, which is a different value, but for the most part, we will be thinking about fair market value. So as I've already sort of hinted, I think there are important and real problems with calculating fair market value, even in a really straightforward case. Professor Rob Howes has referred to the methods used to conduct valuation and investment arbitration as junk science. So there's a lot of critique already existing about valuation, but then if you compound that general concern with the specifics of the fossil fuel industry, I think it gets even worse. So one problem is that there is a widespread belief that currently fossil fuel assets are not being appropriately valued. According to a survey by BNY Mellon, 93% of institutional investors believe that climate change is not being priced into financial markets. So if a substantial amount of a company's book value is based on fossil fuel reserves that must remain in the ground if we are to keep to our climate targets, then how does an arbitral tribunal value that? Are they going to look at it as that's still a valid thing because it's what's on the books, or are they going to say those are going to be stranded assets and worth nothing in the future? In addition to the fact that assets of fossil fuel companies aren't properly priced, we can also see that their liabilities aren't being properly priced. So these companies have huge potential liabilities associated with decommissioning, with environmental cleanup and reclamation, but also unknown and potentially massive legal liabilities associated with the lawsuits that are being brought by investors who believe that they have been lied to, by cities, and even by children who want to hold them account for climate change-related damages. So is an arbitral tribunal going to take any of that into account? I think there are some other arguments that we could make against full compensation. One is that fossil fuel companies have benefited from massive public subsidies. I'm also going to suggest that there's a case for an emergency or necessity defense against full compensation. And finally, I'm going to draw on this idea of contributory negligence. So first on subsidies, I came across this argument in the discussions in the UK around Labour's beliefs that they don't have to pay full market value, and part of that is because they believe that the companies have received such huge public subsidies that that should be discounted against full compensation. I haven't found a good legal argument in international investment law as to why public subsidies should be discounted, but if anyone has one that they could share with me, I would love to hear it. Just to note, this is sort of old data, a couple years old data. I just put it up here to make the point that there is a massive amount of public subsidies that have gone into fossil fuel companies. This is just in terms of exploration. It's obviously far more than private company investment. Moving on, I think that there is an argument to be made that the climate emergency has created a situation that necessitates drastic action, and nationalization should be viewed in this frame. Necessity defenses based on Article 25 of the ILC Articles on State Responsibility have been made in ISDS cases in other contexts. So essentially this can be made when a state can safeguard an essential interest threatened by a grave and imminent peril and that sort of allows it to get out of other obligations for the moment. I think that we can argue that there is a grave and imminent peril to human civilization posed by climate change. However, unfortunately, investment tribunals don't appear to be willing to accept this kind of defense as a defense against payment of compensation. So we can see here in the South American Silver versus Bolivia award, they state that this defense was not designed to excuse the non-payment of compensation for the expropriation. And so I would suggest that if this is the type of reasoning, then they're also not going to accept that that is a justification for paying less when nationalizing a fossil fuel asset. Finally, there's the principle of contributory negligence, which, as noted by Bonicia and Bruin in a recent IISD report, has been applied by investment tribunals to reduce the amount of damages awarded to a claimant where the claimant's own conduct contributed to the loss suffered. I would argue that there is a case to be made that the conduct of fossil fuel companies has directly led to the circumstance that we are currently in, where we must contemplate drastic action to combat climate change, such as nationalization. There have been a number of investigations that have shown that these companies knew about the science of climate change long before the public was aware of the problem, and instead of acting on it, they invested massively in misinformation campaigns and in buying off politicians and generally trying to block action. And that is why they're currently being sued in so many jurisdictions. So it might seem like a long shot, but I think that this is an argument worth making, that they directly contributed to the situation and therefore the amount of compensation should be reduced accordingly. Which I guess leaves the question of what actually I think the compensation paid should be reduced to. So I don't really have time to wade into that whole debate, but I would perhaps just note that in some jurisdictions, like South Africa, there is serious consideration being given to the notion of expropriation without compensation in instances where past harms need to be addressed. I can think of no industry that has done more harm to efforts to combat climate change and thereby more harm to human civilization than the fossil fuel industry. So I see a strong moral, if not necessarily legal, case for nationalization without compensation. Do I actually think that any arbitral tribunal would agree with me? No, definitely not. Which is one of the many reasons, and we can talk in the discussion about the other reasons, why I think that the climate emergency justifies an emergency exit from the investment treaty regime, which in my view would be best accomplished through a multilateral exit treaty, which would ensure a swift and final termination of existing agreements. So that is all I have ready, but I am keen for lots of questions and discussion. Thanks very much.
That's a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. So I guess I'll go, my question is why nationalize if it's going to result in a demand for compensation rather than regulate away? Obviously some fossil fuel reserves are on private lands, but some good number in the US and elsewhere are not. And all of it requires licensing and permitting and all sorts of state and federal or national and subnational approvals. Understanding that a regulatory approach might still wind up in front of would still wind up in front of a dispute settlement body. So the question of compensation might come up. It seems like some of the defenses you're raising may keep compensation at least on the back burner for a while.
That's a great question, and I would say that I haven't done a ton of research on the why nationalization side. I'm hoping to do some more on that, but I was basically just really inspired by the people that were doing it, but then thought, is that going to work legally? But I think basically the general argument is that if you could overcome all the obvious political obstacles to nationalization, it would be like a quicker resolution than regulation, and it would sort of capture everything because you would then be the owner, so you would be responsible for the employees and you would manage the transition, whereas what's more likely to happen if we regulate them out of business is that we'll still be stuck taking care of the people who get left in a lurch. So at least if we were the owners, we would get some of the managed decline would be sort of a little bit more paid for itself. But I agree there are lots of issues to consider. And then the other one is what you already noted, is that definitely if you regulate, it's going to end up in arbitration as well. So I don't know if you've heard about what's happened in Alberta, but the government phased out coal-fired power and provided transition payments to the companies that were providing power so that they could move to gas and to renewables. But there was an American company that was providing the coal that was not provided with transition payments because it wasn't a power provider, it was just an extractive company. But it argued that, it's arguing under a NAFTA case that that is discriminatory because it's an American company, ignoring the fact that it's in a completely different position. And now there's a coal phase out happening in the Netherlands, and they're being threatened with multiple lawsuits under the Energy Charter Treaty. So the same kind of thing is happening. Once, I think that part of this is about if you just tackle things on the demand side, so if you just do carbon taxes and trading schemes and incentives for renewables and so forth, that might end up in arbitration. But once you start going after supply, I think it's a lot easier and a lot more likely that the companies are going to be suing you under arbitration. But I think supply is really where we need to start going. So, and I hope that those arguments would be helpful, but I'm not sure that Tribunal want to take them seriously. Yeah.
Do you think this concept of nationalization for carbon industries is probably more appropriate to be applied by countries with mature economy instead of developing countries? Because I can't really imagine like developing countries they have to earmark a portion of their state budget for compensation, assuming it's lawful. And then if it's unlawful, then they have to be exposed to legal liabilities as well. And second of all, I think that developing countries do not yet have sufficient replacement of carbon industries in place. So the current infrastructure, say in Bangladesh or India, they don't have enough renewable energies yet to sort of meet the demands of the energy. And what would be the incentive for this non-mature economies countries then to follow this approach? But in my opinion, I think it's more appropriate for the countries with mature economy because they have alternatives, they have the budget for it.
Yeah, so definitely there's a couple of things to tease out there. First of all, there are obviously countries in both the north, like Norway, and in the south who already have state-owned oil companies and can debate whether Norway is doing a better job of decarbonizing or not. But in terms of the other aspect where it's like the cost of both investment arbitration and just generally of transitioning, definitely developing countries are in a different, entirely different space. That being said, there is already a lot of progress. I mean, the cost of renewable energies is falling so rapidly that it is on par with a lot of coal and oil and so forth now. So countries like India, for example, are quashing planned coal projects and really ramping up renewable energy. So there is much that can be done in terms of the rest of the world doing a better job helping those countries. And I absolutely think, I'm not really paying attention to what's going on in Madrid right now, but every time we have one of these big COPs, there's a hope that some more money will come out for the global south, but it never seems to be enough. But I agree with you that the situation is different in those countries and there's a different calculus. I think the thing that applies to everyone is that they should get out of the investment regime because it shackles them for so many other issues as well. And they're not benefiting from it because there's really no evidence that the investment regimes helps countries in the global south to attract investment, which was the reason why they signed up to these agreements in the first place. That's how it was sold to them.
Okay, yeah. And then
I had a question regarding the efficiency argument in developing countries. So, state-owned enterprises in developing countries don't have the same level of performance as compared to state-owned enterprises such as in Norway or developed economies. I'm from Pakistan and I can give Pakistan's example. In 1971, there was massive nationalization and that just led to a huge economic catastrophe. All the industries which were performing at a certain level, nationalization just reduced their productivity and efficiency. So from that standpoint as well, nationalization in the case of developing countries to achieve certain climate goals, is it really feasible as opposed to making a series of regulatory changes and working with the private sector?
Again, great question, and I really haven't thought about this in the context of the Global South as much. I do see where you're going with that. I still would argue that it's working with the companies doesn't seem to have gotten us anywhere near where we need to go in terms of decarbonization. And a lot of my concern is that they will continue, while hopefully the countries in the global north will move first, because that's what they should do. If we continue to have the same kind of development path in the global south, then we are all kind of done for, because the amount of emissions will go far beyond what's going to be a livable planet. So I'm not suggesting here today that nationalization is definitely the answer in every context. I basically sort of just thought it was an interesting proposal that goes beyond what a lot of people have been sort of talking about in terms of very incremental policy changes. So I think you'd have to look at it in every country, and definitely whether or not there is that sort of capacity in order to actually properly manage a decline, then yeah, it's going to differ. But I just think it's an interesting idea, and I wanted to explore the sort of legal aspects of whether it's possible. A great question, thank you. Yeah?
Could states use the procedure of counterclaims or the principle of unjust enrichment as possible defenses?
Yeah, I thought about including something on counterclaims in here, and I didn't, just because I didn't have enough time to think about it, but it definitely is one of those things that comes up in that report from Bonica and Bruin from IISD about another way that you can reduce the amount of compensation is by making a counterclaim. I think definitely there is great arguments to be made in lots of cases for counterclaims on not just climate change broadly, but lots of local environmental damage that is done by these companies. However, while I am not, I can probably refer to Lisa and others, but my understanding is that counterclaims are very difficult to get up and haven't traditionally been sort of accepted. I think there has been a few cases recently where it suggests that maybe, like the state had brought up a counterclaim very late in the arbitration, and maybe if they had brought it up at the very outset, then the tribunal might have been more willing to consider it. But thus far, the track record of arbitration doesn't suggest that counterclaims would be a really easy thing to do.
I would just add, I think everything you said exactly, but I would just add to that then there's also the nearly insurmountable attribution problem.
Right.
That, like, in this particular, not only are counterclaims so difficult in general, but in this case you'd have to show the link that this company had led to the crisis, and and that's a challenge in even direct litigation against the company.
Yeah.
I had two questions. Maybe I'll jump in with one and see if it's similar to the other. But we share your concern about these issues. I'm just wondering if you've thought about how to raise these without creating even more of a regulatory chill, or how to, given how challenging it has been to find the emergency exit door, what is the risk that raising this alarm is going to actually put this on the radar, dissuade and inspire companies to.
Oh yeah, I don't worry about inspiring companies, because I feel
they'll
like
find it themselves.
The lawyers are like they're already, obviously in the UK they're way ahead of everybody else. They're like, yeah, we're totally gonna sue you. So I think that they're definitely. I wouldn't worry about inspiring them. They're clued into that. I do worry more about the chilling side, which is why I think when we were talking about the title for this, I wanted to make sure that like obstacles to overcome and like ways to overcome them was in it, because I didn't want to suggest that this meant, definitely don't think about this as a policy option because you will get sued for billions of dollars. But yeah, I think that sort of comes into my mind, but I think it's probably better that countries are prepared for these kind of things, and I mean honestly, nationalization is probably so far away from being thought about seriously by anyone other than Jeremy Corbyn. So I don't anticipate this in the near future. I'm thinking more like as things start to get bad, then it might start to come up as a more realistic option. I mean, hopefully the industry will just sort of go down without us having to do anything about it. That's what one person suggested to me when I was presenting a related paper on this, and they said, well, why should we buy them out when we can just sort of wait for the natural progress of them to be, their share prices to just drop because they will. And my sort of counter argument was I don't think we should pay full market value for it. I think that, but we need to not necessarily just sit back and wait for economics to play its course. We need to do something.
Optimistic worldview to think that will happen in time.
I have to be optimistic. I have children.
My question is related with more practical aspects and the legislative aspects. Have you made any research on the comparative research, like international standards, and how much it's we can find it's in the legislation of the different countries? Because at least the last winter, I was involved on this development of the investment and investment protection of one country. And I have visited several countries. At least I know I have checked 6 countries' legislation on this issue. None of them was mentioned exactly about the climate change effect of the industry. And they were just saying, if a question comes to the nationalization, one of the first, they just mentioning about the pollution of the environment. But it's a little bit too broad, and I believe that even non-government, even the legislative doesn't take care or even doesn't think about that, it should be some specialized this aspect, they think that their country or their industry or economy is too small in comparison with, let's say, Germany or let's say China or maybe United States. So it's not too much important thing to indicate in their legislation. That's why I'm asking, and they don't, they just only one aspect, it's just pollution of the environment. Not they don't go to the much a global level, the warming and so on.
In the investment law, you mean?
Yeah, in investment.
Yeah, no, none of this is in investment law. I'm trying to use things that are already in investment law, like the necessity defense and the contributory defense. Those are things that are used in completely different contexts. I'm just trying to borrow them and twist them around and use them for climate change. There's no investment laws that say that you can expropriate something as long as it's for climate change. People have suggested that there should be a carve-out of in treaties or some kind of external treaty that's made that says, if your case concerns regulation related to climate change, then it can't be challenged under investment law. But that hasn't actually happened. So this is just me trying to be creative with other defenses that are used in other cases.
Do you plan to touch on right to regulate provisions or police powers or others that are outside the expropriation?
Yeah, I haven't really decided what to to do with this yet.
Not that it gives me much confidence in those either.
Yeah, no. I always feel like everything that I'm going to end up saying is just a reason to exit the regime. But this is sort of one piece of a bigger project where a colleague in Australia and I are sort of looking at nationalization more broadly as a climate strategy, and we haven't really gotten to that detail. We started with the pipeline nationalization in Canada and just sort of fell down a rabbit hole of looking at that. Because what intrigued us about that case was the fact that nationalization is considered to be this socialist strategy, and yet here it was being pushed by the industry, it was being welcomed by right-wing think tanks, and then we found other cases where that was kind of happening as well. So there's a coal-fired power plant in Australia that the private owner has a planned shutdown and converting to renewables and gas, and it's had this plan for several years. It's all ready to go, and the right-wing elements of the government are saying, no, you have to keep it open. And very right-wing individuals are saying that the power plant should be nationalized in order to keep it running. And it's like a 50-year-old power plant, right? So it was just really fascinating to see like these, them just sort of abandon that ideology that the market must be left to do its thing, that they always bring up when we're talking about subsidizing wind farms or anything, and say, no, we have to do anything possible to keep it open. And I think Trump was also considering some emergency laws here in the US in order to keep coal-fired power plants going. So we're just sort of fascinated by the fact that nationalization is just this really very polar discussion now, where there's people talking about it very much in a sort of Jeremy Corbyn kind of area, but also thinking about it from an ecological standpoint rather than just a socialist standpoint. And then you got this completely different discussion going on about how to nationalize fossil fuel assets in order to make sure that they don't get shut down. So, so we're planning on just sort of exploring that dynamic a bit more, and then investment arbitration just sort of comes in on the side and looms over, yes.
Were you surprised when the Canadian government last year bought a pipeline on the West Coast? I mean, it just seemed to be out of character for the government.
Yeah, see, I never had the sort of glossy vision of Trudeau as the wonderful prince of Canada who's got great hair, etc. I mean, obviously, when you compare him to in other countries what you have, then he looks great, and he did a really good job of talking the talk. He's out there in the Pride Parade, and he's doing this and that. He was actually even in the Fridays for the Future climate march, and you're like, who are you marching against right now? You are the government. But
opposite by himself.
But Canadian politics, you have to understand, is very dominated by this idea that, again, the power of the industry has to dominate the media and the public perception that we are really reliant on tar sands oil, and that there's also this idea that it's somehow ethical oil, and that I've had people tell me, when the last drop of oil comes out of the ground, I want it to be Canadian oil because it's so much more ethical than Saudi oil, etc. But in reality, it's one of the most carbon-intensive resources in the world, and it should shut down far sooner than any other oil. But you have this, dynamic where they've really managed to create a situation where they are suggesting that the lack of a pipeline means that the oil industry is beholden to the U.S. Because the only available buyer really is down south, and that if we were able to get it to Tidewater, then we get a better price for it. And independent economists have shown that this is actually just kind of bunk. It's a very expensive form of oil because it's so difficult to extract. But the industry has also managed to create this view that the delays to the pipeline have somehow damaged Canada's investment climate. This gets back into the investment area. Because no company that has gone through all the hurdles that Kinder Morgan went through should not be able to do exactly what it wants. And so, just the power of the industry, it doesn't surprise me that Canada was willing to go that far. What did surprise me was just how okay with it the industry was. And I mean, if you look at, there's a lot of documents in Kinder Morgan's annual reports, but also there's some freedom of information stuff that's come out that shows just how much the industry was involved the entire way along. So they gave all the advice to the government about how much it was worth and so forth, and the government probably paid way too much for it compared to what it's actually worth, not even considering the fact that it might become a stranded asset. So it was disappointing. I still hope that some legal battles might stall it from ever actually being built, but I obviously don't like the fact that that my taxes are going to build a pipeline. So yeah, Canada's weird.
To your last point, it's something that we've looked at a little bit, but I wonder if it comes in at all, which is comparing the challenges that are available to challenges that are available to citizens and to opposition, to environmental advocates, or not even advocates, whatever, to citizens, to challenge nationalization. I wonder if you can compare or even comment on even now, what the process is for challenging a nationalization
I don't know if
domestically
there
as
is-
opposed
I don't
to.
know if there is a process, right? Because they're all challenging certain aspects of the environmental impact assessment or whether there was proper consultation with the indigenous groups, but they're not, I don't think anybody's actually challenging the nationalization per se. But yeah.
Highlight the complete
Yeah.
disparity
That's a very
between,
good point. Yeah,
you know, who can challenge
Yeah.
nationalization and what process.
yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, there. Great. Well, thank you
Awesome,
very
thank
much.
you.
You